Trump's imperialist attitude with regard to other nations is gangster imperialism. It's very transactional, like, I'm going to threaten you, I'm going to put up these tariffs, and then we negotiate, we make a deal. It's pure force. Like, I come in with pure force because America is the biggest consumer of the world. It's the wealthiest nation in the world. And he's like, no, we need to throw our weight around. We've gotten bad deals. We're going to need better deals. The liberal form of imperialism is the NGO industry, the non-governmental organization insertion into places of conflict in order to create spheres of American influence within crisis areas with the goal of having American corporate interests being protected or move in afterwards, right? In the 90s, it was human rights. And human rights was the new cover for the end of the Cold War and also genocide. Like they were just using genocide all the time to say that this was going to be a place where intervention was going to be needed.
Hello and welcome to Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Ileana Chan. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. So please subscribe, comment, share, you know the drill. We are also going to be putting the first part of this interview on YouTube and then the full episode on Patreon. And it's also available as an audio podcast on Spotify and Amazon Music on Saturday. Today, I'm very happy to introduce our amazing guest to Global Majority for Peace, Catherine Liu. Catherine is a professor of film and media studies at UC Irvine. She is the author of Virtue Hoarders, The Case Against the Managerial Class, and an upcoming book with Verso tentatively titled Traumatized, which I'm very excited to
It's
read.
got a subtitle now. It's
Oh, good.
Traumatized, the gentrification of suffering and the end of liberalism.
Okay, I am very excited about that book, and we're going to be getting into some of the themes of it later today. But we do like to start interviews with a little bit more of a personal question, the origin of your politicization. Was there a particular incident that has led you to where you are now?
There are a couple of things that are positive and negative instigators. And I would say one of the positive instigators was that I went to elementary school and partially high school and middle school and high school at a time when public schools were very, very functional. And my teachers were very inspired and they were well paid relative to that time, and it was a respected profession. So I came of age at the tail end of all of the New Deal things that had been provided for the public sphere in America. And very quickly, all of that disappeared when Reagan was elected president. But there was one specific incident that I talked about on Midwestern Marks because Bridget there also asked me, like, how did you become politicized? And I think that the question for me of ideology and Western imperialist ideology really became so clear through this one incident. My father was involved with a lot of like left-leaning Chinese people in New York already, and we went to China very often when I was little because he was at the UN and they paid for us to go on home leave every other year. So there was already a lot of talk about Marx, about Mao in my father's social circle. He wasn't very committed to it in the end. I was like a little sponge absorbing everything. But in like 10th grade, or was it ninth or 10th grade in the United States, you do a course called World History. And it was very Cold War, very mechanistic. I just said, like, I had really great teachers. Well, this was one of my worst teachers, but she taught the course according to the textbook. And it was, of course, very American and Cold War serving. And I remember reading on the China module that the Chinese are like little blue ants filing in and out of factories. It's sort of the propaganda about North Korea today, just illustrating this like faceless, anonymous, totalitarian society, like a scene from Metropolis, Fritz Lang's like science fiction silent film. And it was in a textbook. It was in the history textbook describing China. And I was someone who had been to China a number of times through the 70s. And so this was like maybe 79 or something. And I raised my hand and I just said to my teacher, like, this is not true. This is not true. This is not how China is. And it made me doubt like everything that was in the textbook, right? And she came back at me and said, Miss Liu, you open your mouth again, I'll put my size 8 shoe in it. I was like very vocal because I was like, this is just not right. There's a lot more life in China. It's not just workers. If you see them as ants, then you think of them as disposable. This is not accurate. And so I walked out of the classroom and I said, I'm not coming back in here until you apologize to me. I don't know how I had that kind of like self-assurance, but it was just such a glaring, like authoritarian act. And we, met the counselor and my mom came in and my mom was like, yeah, doesn't Kathy have such a big mouth? Because my mom just thought I was very anti-intellectual and just thought I was a troublemaker. But my teacher felt like maybe she was going to be in trouble. So the counselor was there and she was like, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. I just say things like that. And then after that, I was like, wow, I can't believe everything I say. And yet the liberal propaganda is so powerful and my parents' fear of getting into political trouble because they had grown up in authoritarian regimes, that I felt that I had to keep my skepticism hidden. And as I became more and more committed to leftism on my own, I was reading the Frankfurt School on my own. I took 1 or 2 courses on Marx as an undergraduate, and it was so against the grain of what was happening in the 80s and 90s. I always felt like I was like the underground woman. There were things I really cared about. Then I had to like have produce this different kind of affect for the public and for my academic career. So I really learned about alienation. And part of that, I think, is also about being Chinese American. There's a face for the outside, there's a face for the inside. And there was a face that I couldn't share with anyone, which was my pursuit of ideology critique, which in the 80s and 90s was totally unpopular because everyone was going through to cultural studies, thank you, Great Britain, and we were all going to celebrate popular culture, and it was Tony Blair's third way, and so the left was in disarray at that time. And my feeling at the time was that, well, maybe communism has failed. Maybe socialism really has failed. I still think this is the best political and economic theory for understanding ideology, but I kind of have to keep it to myself. And, everyone's like into Deleuze, into Derrida, or just straight on intellectual history. And, I was a very fucked up kid. Like maybe I should have just gone and studied with David Harvey. I didn't love Fred Jameson stuff, but I could have found like a mentor. The person I really admired was Mike Davis, and he wasn't taking students. He was just like a real rogue guy. Totally respect him for that. But there were very few like real Marxist mentors. Nancy Fraser and the sort of philosophical leftist feminists, that I don't do philosophy. I'm not a philosopher. I don't think Marx should be read as philosophy. And so I was just like deep in culture. My advisors were all second wave feminists. And so Marx and Freud were just patriarchs. And I kind of had to keep it hidden. But that's called alienation. That's the cost of growing up under an ideological regime that the liberals don't want to admit is actually quite authoritarian, especially during the Cold War.
I think that's a really good way to describe it, alienation. And I think that's why I really gravitated towards your interviews and your work, because the psychological use of the word gaslighting, the very popularized use of the word gaslighting. But certainly I think we feel that. We feel gaslit when we're like, this is not the truth, and you're making us feel like we're the problem. But anyway, that is why I'm so happy to have you on this podcast. Of course, we are a geopolitical, anti-imperialist, anti-war podcast, and we like to link and highlight how, well, for us in the UK, we're based in the UK, Britain's foreign policy is often subordinate to the US, and
Yeah.
how Britain is really can be seen as a complicit junior partner of the US empire, and how that is often or is perhaps our primary obstacle to achieving social and economic progress and wealth redistribution. I mean, obviously that can be quite controversial statement, but I felt like your book, Virtue Hoarders, The Case Against the Professional Managerial Class, observes American class dynamics, which similarly do exist here in the UK. And it gives us a really useful framework for how the manufacturing of consent for the imperialist neoliberal agenda is achieved, despite that being contrary to the general public's interest. Can you start by explaining what you mean by the professional managerial class? Because I think a lot of people might not know what that is, and how they function to uphold ruling class interests.
Well, it is a class of white collar workers who, I think it might have been Mills who said this, C. Wright Mills, but they are the workers who work in air conditioning. If you want to think about this in like a subtropical colonial, neo-colonial thing, it's like they're a group of workers who work in climate control. I mean, that's kind of a joke, but this class has credentials. It doesn't work with its body. It usually has to obey certain rules of professional organizations, like in the American context, American Academy of University Professors regulate certain actions and conditions of the professoriate. The American Bar Association and the American Medical Association regulate the behavior and the actions of lawyers and doctors, respectively. And they really come up in power throughout the 20th century. And I would actually say that there was a moment when this class was very, very small. Like there are some statistics from the labor analysis that says in 1900, maybe white collar workers only made up 3% of the American workforce. And American agricultural workers made up 25%. The rest was industrial workers and then other kinds of service itinerant workers. And today that number has been reversed. You know, there are 25, 27, sometimes people say 35% of the American workforce has a professional managerial job. But I think we can refine this by saying that there are certain professionals who manage other people. And there are certain professionals who do their jobs, like nurses and teachers. They're professionals. They don't manage other people. They teach, they can provide a service job. In the factories and in the 19th century classical Marxist mercantile firm, this class has roots as foremen, as clerks, as accountants. And Marx said that these kinds of people who were delegated by the capitalists to regulate, discipline, and control the flow of money and labor were in the pre-modern period more like family servants. So they were working alongside or often in the offices in the homes of the mercantile capitalists. As the functions of the corporation become more and more complex, as logistics lines become more and more dense, especially with the British Empire, you have a whole level of lawyers, insurers, everyone who is not lifting things, but managing the flow of those things. And in 1977, John and Barbara Ehrenreich wrote the tracts Professional Managerial Class about how they had noticed that in left and liberal political spaces, increasingly the working class was marginalized for professional managerial class interests, college educated people who were presenting a new cultural vanguard. And there was a split in the liberal left between the old school, old left, labor-based progressives and this kind of like liberal progressivism that was taking place. I would say like the values of the American professional managerial class have to do with meritocracy. And I don't mean that in a good way. I mean that as a kind of social sorting that was a term of insult that was actually invented by Michael Young, who was a British labor politician of the 1950s, who said that if capitalism is becoming more and more of a meritocracy, not an aristocracy, and the meritocracy is rewarding ruling class elites by saying you're just smarter than everyone else. So rather than using nepotism to get into Oxford or Cambridge, you have to test into it. And you arrive at the sort of top of British society because of your smarts, not because of your feudal connections. And so it's a new configuration of sorting for ruling elites. There's a lot of reasons why this meritocratic form is very American. And it was exported after World War II. It was supposed to be rewarding the cream of the crop of people, creating a kind of equality within capitalism that had to do with competition, rewarding the smartest. And a lot of the diversity initiatives and the anti-racism initiatives that presided by this class is about selecting the smartest people from all genders, all sexualities, all races, all ethnic backgrounds, so that they can occupy this stratum of capitalist society where you can ascend from any kind of background and test into the elite in this way. So the history of meritocracy is deeply connected to the history of this class because they think that they've overturned inherited privilege and wealth. But increasingly in America, at least, and I think in Britain as well, college educated people with cultural capital pass it on to their children.
Oh yeah, I mean definitely I think in the UK. So the professional managerial class you were saying was the cultural vanguards, the virtue hoarders. They set the standards for which we are supposed to aspire to. For virtue signaling, it's purposefully devoid of social and historical and political context, and this serves to obscure the real transgressions being made. Obviously, we're in a time when it's like the cultural wars are happening. So you have the right engaging with this by opposing the liberal left within this narrow, superficial scope of debate. But when we kind of use this framework and we focus outward and we look at it on a geopolitical scale, we can look at something like USAID as a pretty accurate encapsulation of this dynamic, which I think is, it's interesting because USAID, for many people, they still do believe it's masquerading as a virtuous endeavor, but it's actually a tool of American imperialism. But a lot of people aren't aware of that. So when Trump gives the reasons for cutting the agency as like, oh, DEI, he's anti-woke and all that stuff, the reaction to this in the global South is actually really different from the official narrative that comes out of the liberal left. So many people view Trump's action as like mask off type of moments for US empire. But can you help us unpack where the American people are maybe on that, the general public, and your view on it?
You mean about US aid or just general like dismantling of the state and DEI and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, because the thing with it is that I think Trump is on one hand doing some very, very obvious imperialist moves. And then on the other hand, the USAID thing, this is like their cover, right? Like this is their virtue signaling.
Trump's imperialist attitude with regard to other nations is gangster imperialism. It's very transactional, like, I'm going to threaten you, I'm going to put up these tariffs, and then we negotiate, we make a deal. It's pure force. Like, I come in with pure force because America is the biggest consumer of the world. It's the wealthiest nation in the world. And he's like, no, we need to throw our weight around. We've gotten bad deals. We're going to need better deals. The liberal form of imperialism is the NGO industry, the non-governmental organization insertion into places of conflict in order to create spheres of American influence within crisis areas with the goal of having American corporate interests being protected or move in afterwards, right? In the 90s, it was human rights. And human rights was the new cover for the end of the Cold War and also genocide. Like they were just using genocide all the time to say that this was going to be a place where intervention was going to be needed, right? It select very, very selectively, depending upon what the military industrial complex had to gain from the intervention or American industry had to gain from it. So what you have is this kind of like gangster imperialism, mask off, as you say, or replacing a kind of faux philanthropic attitude towards the world. So all of the reporting about USAID was that millions of people are going to die if the Americans withdraw. So you have this sense of megalomania, like we are actually saving millions of people every day by being in Africa, by offering HIV medicine, by doing this, and they personalize it. It's like face after face of people who are suffering. This is a very liberal technique in the news without without looking at any of the context of where USAID is, of what USAID does to undermine sovereignty, of what USAID does as a sort of precursor for other forms of American imperialism. And I don't have the research right at my fingertips, but we've known for years that USAID is a cutout for the CIA. People know that it was just general knowledge, right? On the left. And if you listen to a lot of people from places that have where USAID was a strong presence, a lot of the left leaders are saying, yeah, get them out of here. But the American philanthropic, USAID driven foreign policy does something that I try to describe in Virtue Hoarders, which is it hypostasizes the weak as the recipient of help. And that person, that victim, that survivor, that citizen of the global South is in need. And the actor, the sovereign, the agent, the provider of help is the American, is the aid giver. It's another form of Victorian charity. And what Victorian charity was meant to do was to quell worker unrest. It was just very, very clear. It was the moralization of inequality. The only person who could correct it was the church, the lady, the giver, the Royal Society. And it merely cements and reinforces power relations and inequality, and you remain in this state of serving the worthy poor and leaving behind the unworthy poor. So there's this kind of like triage going on. I can't speak for the conscience of every USAID worker. They are probably thinking they're doing good. They probably go into it thinking they went to elite schools, they have medical degrees or social science degrees, and they think we're going to Africa, we're going to do these things. But it's always about decontextualizing a situation of need and having America be the provider of all that is good. And so you have this stripping away of USAID from the right. And it was very, very clear that wherever there are forces of corruption and inequity, if the left didn't get in there and work on it, all of these things would eventually come, the bill and all of these things would come paid. And it was the right and the far right who are dismantling this because the liberals don't want to hear any criticism of USAID from the left. I mean, if you think about this, there could have been a realignment of American foreign policy through left intervention. But the Democratic Party will not let its left flank, and the left flank is just completely fucked up anyway, have any kind of power. But the Republican Party allowed itself to be taken over by its far right flank. And so this is what we're seeing today. I can't emphasize this enough. One of the reasons why I was so committed to the Frankfurt School and was very, very unfashionable to be thinking about them, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, was something that they were writing about constantly, which was the fact that the logical end of liberal capitalism is fascism. And the only way to take that apart is to have a robust ideological critique and political program from the left. And we're just seeing that happen now. I mean, I don't want to be like, I told you so, but they told us so.
I mean, it is just very, very frustrating because now it's almost impossible to untangle. I mean, one of the things that I think you've mentioned before is with Gloria Steinem being funded by the CIA or, being part of a CIA project to, I suppose, decontextualize, as you've talked about, feminism when it's a very real issue. We definitely need feminism, but now it's been sort of destroyed in many aspects and used as a pretext for intervention.
If you look at the evolution of American feminism, it was always funded and promoted by wealthy women. So the suffragettes who achieved female suffrage in 1920 for American women were generally very, very wealthy women. And there were one or two really wealthy women who sponsored the legislation and lobbied. And so it always had a class basis. But its class formation in the 1970s became all the more stark because second wave feminism was a professional managerial class feminism. And throughout the 30s and 40s, there were socialist feminists who were marginalized during the McCarthy era, during the anti-communist era. And these were women who were really focused on work issues, leave issues, maternity care, childcare issues. But you see in the 70s, and it was totally directed by upper middle class, professional class women, there's a complete focus on a kind of libertarian attitude towards sexuality, sexual freedom, and then abortion rights becomes their singular focus. Singular. It's also part of this NGOization of the social movements that happened in the 70s. It's really chilling to look at how a lot of these movements that grew out of the social movements became just like fundraising organizations and lobbyists. And I
Yeah,
think you call them charities in the UK.
yeah, I think it's interesting to hear the origin of feminism because I think from an American perspective, just because personally I was introduced to it by my parents, it was the whole thing about women hold up half of the sky, the communist. I have not researched whether or not there is any other, but to me it comes across as like something quite different from.
Well, Mao and the Chinese Communist Party really did want to break the back of the Confucian family in China. And since Deng Xiaoping's reforms, people have walked that back, and so there's a lot of reconfucianization. But one of the things that about modernity and modernization from the Republican Revolution onward in 1911 was modernizing China. And modernizing China meant changing the position of women in Chinese society. So chattel slavery, arranged marriages were outlawed by the first Republican government. And then with the communists, you had this idea that outside of the Confucian hierarchy, we want to endow women and men with the right to marry people they love. That was like considered, that was revolutionary after 1949. And also because of the lack of a cadre of educated people, we needed to educate women to fill positions of teaching in the party, everything else. And Mao came up with that slogan, women hold up half the sky. And one of the things that can be construed now as like cruelty and child abuse was that in the communes, in the collectives, there were 24-hour nurseries. Like you could send your kid to a nursery school because you were building the revolution. And it was about breaking this kind of like Chinese family clan idea. We've gone back to it. The clan had to be substituted for the party. And that was also about trying to break this kind of pre-modern mobster. It was also very mobster-like. Like I have to accrue all the power to my clan. I have a completely different relationship to my clan. When I look at the people from the other clan, they're competitors. I kill them. At the highest level, it becomes warlordism and gangsterism. So the communists were trying to create a civic society, secularizing the Chinese family, and a lot of that had to do with changing the way that women were seen. It was the same thing in the Soviet Union, but once communism collapsed, women became sex workers again. The whole transactional thing about young women and the trans mercantile capitalism just brought back all of these economic disparities. And one of the things that the communists were really proud of was actually destroying the networks of prostitution in Shanghai, which was one of the biggest, sort of sex work, drug networks in Asia. And all of that has kind of come back. The CCP doesn't want it to come back. It's just very hard to control.
I was going to head into territory that they're not really equipped to head into in terms of like comparing that to like South Korea or, you know, I mean, there's definitely confident women legacies or whatever there. But yes, a digression, sorry. But in your upcoming book, tentatively titled Traumatized, and now we have a semicolon, which I did not remember.
The gentrification of suffering and the death of liberalism.
Very cool. You talk about trauma being decontextualized. Now, granted, I have not read this. Rather, I've listened to an address that you gave in Georgetown, which we can link below because I think it's really fascinating address. But you cite the example of Judith Herman's book, Trauma and Recovery, where she talks about the trauma experienced by Chilean political prisoners under Pinochet without acknowledging the US-led anti-communist campaign that instigated it. Can you expand on the implications of this further? Because I found that really fascinating.
So Herman was talking about this technique to help people recover from trauma called flooding, where you relive the trauma with a therapist, where you write down what you've experienced, or sometimes you reenact even like scenes of childhood abuse and everything. Because you're in a safe environment and you repeat the experience, you can overcome it. And it was pioneered in the Veterans Administration for soldiers suffering from PTSD. And then Herman very casually says that a lot of this technique was first used by these Chilean psychiatrists and psychoanalysts for people who had survived Pinochet's torture cells and who were leftists who had been persecuted by him. And so I went and actually read through the accounts of the clinical account written by Ana Julia Cienfuegos and Cristina Minelli. And the amazing thing about what they did was Pinochet had now been brought to power. He had fallen from power. And in the aftermath of this, they thought, or actually, Pinochet was still in power. They were doing this in the underground for a while, and then they made it more official. They treated victims in such a way that they could take down their testimony and sort of put the Pinochet regime on trial in a clinical setting. Like, this happened to you because you were working with Salvador Allende, you opposed American imperialism. Pinochet grabs you from the street and tortures you, imprisons you. And it was to create a political, social context for people who were completely broken, but not broken just individually and physically. The psychoanalysts and psychiatrists were emphasizing that these young people lost hope for the future. And so they taped their testimonies and they would stage these mock trials of the torturers, of the victimizers, hoping to restore a sense of agency and heal these victims of Pinochet's regime. Cienfuegos and Minelli were very modest about what they thought could happen, but they said this is a really important documentation of the testimony of the victims of Chile's military dictatorship, right? None of this is in the Herman book. And in the last chapter, she's actually very supportive of NATO and US bombing of Yugoslavia and the breakup of Yugoslavia because there's all these human rights violations. So it was really like striking to me that you have people who are a victim of US imperial policy, foreign policy. Absolutely no clear victimization. And the US medical establishment and the feminists are extracting this technique and this wisdom from a nation. I mean, we can use global south. I like to use the third world, but they victimize you and then they extract your technique of healing, your therapies that you've actually pioneered in order to restore political agency to the victims of your foreign policy. You're decontextualizing it and bringing it back to saying this can heal American victims of trauma in the rape clinics, where she was seeing a lot, treating a lot, many people women who were also in their own context. I mean, I don't think I can unseal any of this records, but it's very clear that many of them came from blue collar, working class Irish families near Harvard, Cambridge, from this town of Somerville, where she was treating a lot of these women. So you have all of these kinds of depoliticizing movements, these really politically naive apprehensions of both the therapeutic technique and the narratives of recovery. Like, she doesn't ever say, like, wow, why were these people being tortured? Or what role did America have to play in this? America had to play a huge role in this. So it just seemed to me like this kind of political naivete about trauma and recovery was extracting something once again from the global south. And the whole thing about America's fear of communism drove it to support the most murderous regimes. I mean, we're not even talking about Indonesia. I mean, I don't think, that whole thing, the trauma of Indonesia should be front and center in any discourse about foreign policy and trauma. But if you look at the literature on trauma, communists, victims of American imperialism, never figure as important agents of any of these trauma narratives. So I just think that it fits in well with the Cold War attitude about American superiority. Because one of the other moral superiority, because the other aspect of the trauma narrative in the 80s and 90s was that as the Berlin Wall was falling, as Eastern Europe was being integrated into the global capitalist network, a lot of the rhetoric around NGOs and around the reintegration of these former communist countries was that they did not deal with the Holocaust. We did. They didn't reckon with the European past. So we have better psychological tools to deal with trauma. They're in denial, and to be integrated into Western Europe and the global capitalist flows, they have to acknowledge that they are behind in terms of dealing with this horrific thing that happened in Europe in World War II. And that gives the sort of professional managerial class executors of the terms of the end of the Cold War a kind of moral superiority as well.
Yeah, that's so interesting too, because I think it's so much of a part of our Western culture now to use psychological terms somewhat inaccurately, but it's just so widespread. And to have this idea of,
Not only inaccurately, but to take our culture of therapy and just impose it upon other cultures, other places. There are certain universal principles about the psyche. I'm deeply invested in psychoanalysis that I think are absolutely necessary to look at. But one of the things about trauma, from any point of view, is that it is embedded in a culture, and each culture deals with suffering in its own way. But one of the things that the United States and Britain follows along with is imposing a narrative of recovery from that. So I call that the trauma script. And you impose the trauma script as a healer or an imperialist, a professional, and that is just not very good therapy either, but it is definitely American foreign policy. Like, you guys suffered, this is how you're going to recover. And we have the best techniques, we have the best drugs. In Ethan Waters' Crazy Like Us, he said that a lot of the US aid packages that go into post-crisis places like Indonesia, Thailand during the post-tsunami earthquake world was feminine hygiene. You get a package of feminine hygiene and antidepressants and psychotropic drugs.
thank you for watching the first part of our interview with Catherine Liu. Head over to patreon.com/empirewatch for the full interview. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.